Hello and welcome to the show, coming to you from London. Today we speak with an award-winning British author who's delved into Soviet archives to find out more about Stalin. Hello and welcome. Stalin the Great. Is it possible that history may soon regard a man considered one of the world's most evil dictators as a great leader who created an empire and brought security and prestige to his people? Although Joseph Stalin is often held responsible for the deaths of around 25 million Soviets, a new picture is emerging, one that reveals a contradictory, flesh and blood human being. The opening of the Soviet archives provides an unprecedented glimpse into the life of Stalin, including the young man's love letters and unpublished family memoirs. On today's show, we speak with an award-winning historian and author about the never-before-revealed aspects of Stalin's life. And don't forget, we take your questions and comments on this program via phone and mobile text. The numbers are on your screen. Joining me in our London studios is Simon Sebag Montefiore, a best-selling biographer and author of Young Stalin, a book which relies on first-hand sources and portrays the thrilling story of a bank-robbing, prolific lover and fanatical revolutionary. Simon Sebag Montefiore, welcome to the program. And I've got to ask you, and I guess first congratulate you on the award-winning side of this. I believe you have the ceremony coming up on Tuesday.
That's right. That's right. We do. It's very exciting, and it's very nice having written a sort of book that's essentially a sort of scholarly book, or in a sense based on archives, that people have sort of appreciated it, and it's got quite a populist prize, which so I'm very excited.
I think a lot of it comes down to also your writing style, which is, I have to say, very accessible. But I have to ask you, why is this book so important?
I think it's important because we never knew anything about Stalin beforehand, and before the archives opened in the late 90s, and they didn't open with the fall of the Soviet Union. They actually opened very recently, about 7 or 8 years ago, and this is the result of those archives opening. And it really does show Stalin in his origins, and that's very important because it explains much of what we see in Russia today.
A lot of them were in Georgia, and he was from Tbilisi.
That's right.
And you actually were able to get access to them. How?
Well, actually, they were closed, and the president of Georgia, Saakashvili, very kindly opened them so I could use them. And no one really knew what was in them, and most historians really worked in Moscow and hadn't really bothered to go down to Tbilisi. And I've spent a lot of time. I was a war correspondent in Georgia in the early 90s after the breakup of the Soviet Union. So I knew the place well. I've known all the presidents of Georgia, and it's a very exciting and turbulent country.
I have to ask you, you point out many of Stalin's faults and the terrible things he did both in his personal life and obviously in his political life. Could he ever be considered, as I was mentioning in the open, a great man?
Well, if you measure greatness in the way that you'd measure greatness in the case of Tamerlane or Genghis Khan, yeah, sure. I mean, after all, he conquered an empire. He made the Russian Empire greater than any of the emperors did. He found Russia in chaos and weak. He left it as a nuclear superpower. So on paper, yes, you could say he was great if you measure greatness in pure power terms. But at what cost? 20, 25 million people killed, such ruthlessness, such misery caused for tens of millions of others. So I would say no, but I think the interesting point of your question may be that in Russia today, I think it's going that way, and I think he will be known as Stalin the Great within about 5 or 10 years.
I was going to ask you about that, the fact that young kids are being taught that he was a strong leader, and that's being taught above the fact that he was responsible for such a large number of deaths.
That's right. I mean, President Putin has just brought in a new textbook. I mean, actually, he's not the author of it, but he's actually introduced it to Russian teachers. So it's very important, this. And in this textbook, it describes Stalin as the sort of Bismarck of Russia, the most successful ruler of the 20th century. And it really minimizes the impact of his terror. So I think it is actually only a matter of time before he is regarded as Stalin the Great.
Let me get a quote to you that from your book. In the early part, you talk about his character, summarizing his character in a very interesting way. And you say, Stalin's success was at least partly due to his unusual combination of education, thanks to the seminary, and street violence. He was that rare combination of both intellectual and killer. It's kind of an intriguing thought that, that there was this powerful brain behind this very vicious man as well.
Well, that's right, because most politicians are one or the other. There are a lot of politicians that have come to power through the barrel of a gun. And there are a lot of politicians that come up through intellectual power. I mean, like Lenin really is an example. I mean, he seized power, but he had no sort of experience himself in any street violence. While Stalin, on the other hand, had both. I mean, it was very unusual that someone could be highly educated. The seminary where he was at school, at high school, was like an English public school. It was a boarding school. And it was a classical education. You learnt your Plato and the great works, the great classics. So Stalin could write. I mean, I'm not saying he was, you know, a genius as a writer, but he was an intellectual. He read all the time. He was fascinated by reading, and he had this kind of classical basis. At the same time, he could set up a bank robbery, organize an assassination, which not many sort of politicians who can write good articles can do.
And the fact he got a young teenage girl pregnant, he had a string of lovers, it's kind of intriguing stuff from his early life, which I guess has never really made it to the public domain. What did you find personally most interesting about his life?
Well, I think the family life is fascinating. I think it's fascinating that we found in this archive in Georgia, we found his mother's memoirs. Not long memoirs, just about 14 or 15 or 16 pages of typed script, but fascinating, because we then, for the first time, we could really see how Stalin's mother regarded him. But I think also the love life is very interesting. As a man of almost 40, he seduced a 13-year-old girl and made her pregnant twice, became engaged to her, and then typically for Stalin ran off and left her. So he was a complete rogue. But I guess the political stuff, the political training, the mixture of violence and intellectual is the most important part of the book. And the way that we show him as a terrorist mastermind, who, the prototype of a terrorist mastermind, if you like, who can tell us stuff about Al-Qaeda, for example. This is how modern terror was created by the Bolsheviks and other terrorists at that time.
What's fascinating, and we're seeing some of the pictures as you talk from the book, and you managed to get some amazing pictures of his early life. It's really quite intriguing. One thing that does come up a lot in the book is his relationship with Lenin, who took him on as a sort of, his own thug, I guess, to some degree, but a sort of protege as well.
That's right.
And what in learning about Stalin and these undiscovered aspects of Stalin, what new aspects of Lenin came out?
Well, I mean, the fascinating thing about Lenin is that Stalin was always regarded by the left or progressive opinion across the world. Stalin was regarded as a distortion, a monster, while Lenin was regarded as essentially a philanthropic figure who personified the best aspects of Marxism, the decent aspects. This has been shown to be completely false, and much of that comes out in this book. I mean, the archives, where I got much of the Stalin material, also has Lenin's papers. And in these papers, he's shown as a frenzied killer, ordering the hanging, killing, public display of bodies of tens of thousands of people at random. And so we see a very different Lenin. And one of the interesting things about Lenin-Stalin is that, yes, I mean, Stalin was Lenin's ruffian. Lenin liked having someone who knew how to bury bodies, as it were, to do black work. But actually, they actually had very similar attitudes to politics, to the ruthlessness of politics.
Let me get an email question we got to you, please, Simon. This one came in from Dwight in New Jersey, in the USA. And Dwight says, what reaction have you gotten, if any, from those remaining who knew Stalin? Because you did interview some people who did actually know him.
Yes, I did. Well, funny enough, a lot of people, I've spoken to a lot of people, I had letters from a lot of people, because this book is also part of a sort of pair of books that form a full biography. One is Stalin, the Court of the Red Tsar, which is the other book, which is about Stalin in power. And I've had a lot of letters from people that that knew Stalin, that grew up in the Kremlin and so on. And they all said, it's amazing that how you've managed to get the real culture of how it worked, how the system worked. And so I'm quite proud of that. It's one of the things that have most pleased me about it.
Did any of them see him as that great figure that you say some people are being taught he was?
Yeah, some of them did. But more of them grew up in families that knew, their fathers knew him very well. And so they really grew up knowing him as a sort of, as a familiar character. They didn't quite see him as the giant that, that people see him who didn't know him. And they heard the stories about him. And then they saw him gradually leave all domestic life. So by the end of his life, he was so isolated. He was on his own. He had no friends.
Interestingly, you say in your book, and I want to touch on this from the book when you're quoting on his legacy, interesting thing you write near the end, which you say, until his last day, Stalin never ceased trying to glorify his past and conceal his early mistakes. The cult served his shameless vainglory and contributed to his political potency, yet he liked to assume a becoming modesty in front of colleagues. So, I mean, was he in denial by the end, to some degree?
Oh, yeah. I mean, he was in total denial. I mean, he on one hand, he believed he was the greatest man that had ever lived. He had a messiah complex. On the other hand, he was hyper intelligent, and so he knew that the cult was really a stupid thing. He believed that it was very important that everyone should worship him as a god. It was politically useful, it was necessary, and yet he was slightly ashamed of it. And sometimes he'd read the papers and he'd just be infuriated by the stuff in it because it was so moronic. And of course, all cults, and we see this across the world, we saw this with Saddam Hussein, for example. So, I mean, most cults are ridiculous, and yet they serve a political purpose.
And of course, you wrote that first book, as you say, about him in power, the Red Tsar.
The Red Tsar.
Right,
yeah.
And now you've got this as a sort of, it's really a prequel.
It is
done
a
as a sequel, and I wonder, when you look at what you've learned about Stalin, how it shaped your image of him, especially this later phase, learning about the younger Stalin. How has that shaped what you think of him personally?
It shaped it enormously, because when I started off, I had no views on what young Stalin would be like. And that's very important when you write this sort of book, I find, is that you don't want to start with some sort of prejudice that you're going to find this, you're going to find that. What I find really surprised me, the sort of roguish side of him, for a start, amazed me. The photographs I found explained it. I mean, he actually is quite an attractive man, for a start. That was a surprise. And then, and as I said, the intellectual life was very surprising. But he's already becoming Stalin. Even though he doesn't adopt the name till 1912, 1913, he's already a morose character, dark, brooding. He absolutely was born for conspiracy. The conspiratorial world was his habitat, and that's why when he became dictator, the most powerful man in the entire world, he still always behaved like a man who slept. He slept in a different place every night. Even when he was in a house, he slept on different places. He didn't even like beds. He liked sofas and divans, because he was just used to keeping moving all the time. So that's a fascinating thing about him. But it also teaches a lot about the Bolsheviks, because when they came to power, they still behaved. Even though they were in the Kremlin, they were working in giant palaces, they were running the biggest empire in the world, as I said, they still behaved as if they were a little conspiratorial gang of 10 or 20 guys sitting behind a pub in London or in Tbilisi or in Moscow, and they still ruled as a sort of conspiracy. And that's very important to understanding the Soviet Union. Well,
it's interesting you say that, because we had an email question that came from Maria in Canada, and I have to ask you about this because as you say, there are lessons to be learned.
Sure.
And the question from Maria says, looking at Putin's Russia, do you see similarities with the way Stalin ran Russia?
The answer to that is I don't. I mean, there aren't direct parallels between, and I don't think Putin could ever be Stalin, would ever want to be Stalin. I mean, for a start, Putin doesn't have an ideology. Putin is not a communist, he's not a Marxist. Stalin was a fanatical Marxist, and that explains everything. Also, Russia today is much freer than it ever was under the Bolsheviks. There is no terror now. But having said that, Putin has a very powerful secret police. The secret police are more powerful than they've ever been before. And this secret police, now called the FSB, in various times called the Cheka, the NKVD, the KGB, that secret police was created by Lenin and Stalin. And its ethos was created by the conspiratorial underground, which Stalin personifies in this book. I mean, if one wants to understand that weird mixture, which you see in Putin's Russia, of swaggering arrogance, and yet sort of slightly sleazy gangsterism, as you saw in the Litvinenko case. If you want to understand that, you go back and you can see it. These people in young Stalin, these young revolutionaries, they assassinated each other, they assassinated people, they kidnapped people, they raided banks. In them, you see the ethos that was created in the secret police that became the heart of the Soviet state and which we still see today.
We have an email, sorry, we have a caller on the line, Khurram in Saudi Arabia. Khurram, what would you like to ask?
Hi, Riz, how are you doing? I actually have
Good,
a
thanks.
question, and I'm enjoying your show right now. He
Thank
said, Al-Qaeda, and, looking at the, life of Stalin, I would want to find out two things. Number one, do you think, obviously, you're a guest, think that, Osama bin Laden would be regarded in the future similarly to Stalin,
Right.
like people think he's a villain right now, or a terrorist,
Right.
to put it the right way. And do you think there's a similarity between how they are doing things and how Stalin was doing things in his time?
Okay, great question. Thanks, Khurram.
It's a good question. Thank you. Yeah, I think there is a similarity. I think, Of course, there are enormous differences, but I think there are similarities. One is in the way that that people like Stalin, these Bolsheviks, and people like Al-Qaeda run their organizations. That's one thing. The system of secrecy and so on. Of course, there's huge differences now. We have mobile phones and computers, etc. now, but there are big differences. And secondly, yeah, I mean, a leader like Osama bin Laden could well be, regarded by some people as a hero in the future. On the other hand, many people may regard him as a great monster. And so
it's a perspective thing, isn't it? Really,
it's a perspective thing. It depends which side of the fence you are. And people become. But like I said, Stalin was born a Georgian. Georgian was his first language. It's a completely different language to Russian, for example. And yet now he's regarded as a Russian hero, like a Russian Tsar. So Osama bin Laden may be regarded as something completely different than he is in the future.
Just a couple of minutes to go, so I want to ask you, you've done these two major works on Stalin, very comprehensive. Is there anything left to write about him now?
I think Stalin is always a fascinating character. So I think there always will be stuff to write, and there are many other things I could have written. But for me, that's enough now. I need to escape from Stalin.
You've done a number of great books, I have to point out, and one of them, which I've enjoyed going through, is 101 World Heroes.
Oh,
now, I'm curious about the title, Great Men and Women for an Unheroic Age. What did you mean by that?
I just meant that in the present age, we're dominated by celebrity culture. We're by people who we regard as heroic, people who show emotion on television usually. Well, in fact, I think heroism is really about courage and selflessness and sacrificing yourself for other people, and doing things that improve the tolerance of peoples between to live together.
I have to say it's fascinating because it's so easy to thumb through it, and it's quite gripping, so hard to put down.
Thank you.
And I have to ask you, with just really as we wrap up,
yeah.
Your book, A Biography on Jerusalem, is your next project.
That's right.
What is that about? How do you do a biography of Jerusalem?
Well, what it's going to be is, the reason why it says biography is because, first of all, cities have lives too. They can be personalities. But also, many people have written about Jerusalem as, three religions, one city, and that's been done. A lot has been written about Jerusalem, Israel versus Palestine, and so on and so forth. I want to write about the whole history and perspective. So the last 50 years will be a small part. What it's about is, and why it's called the biography is, this is going to be a sweeping history of Jerusalem over 3,000 years, through the lives of the great men and women who created the city.
Well, Simon, I want you to promise you'll come back and talk about that when it's done.
I'd love to. Thank you very much.
It's been a pleasure speaking with you.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you. And thank you for being with us. On tomorrow's programme, we look at a controversial new plan to establish standards of practice for Britain's mosques in an effort to combat terrorism, extremism, I should point out. Don't forget, if you have any thoughts about pressing issues around the world, send your emails to riz@aljazeera.net. We'll see you next time. The Street Talk is next.